Professor Beatty refers to me as a revolutionary thinker. When I was young, no one could have imagined that I would amount to anything intellectually speaking. I certainly did not care for school. But I did have a passion for natural history. And more especially for collecting. Already, at a very young age, I collected all sorts of things. Shells, wax seals, francs, coins, and minerals. The passion for collecting, which leads a man to be a systemic naturalist, or a virtuoso, or a miser, was very strong in me. I can illustrate my zeal for collecting with a story from when I was a bit older. I was tearing off some old bark one day in search of some beetles, and I saw two rare specimens, such that I seized one in each hand. But then I saw a third, an even more rare kind, which I could not bear to lose, so that I popped the one that I held in my right hand into my mouth. Alas, it ejected some intensely acrid fluid which burnt my tongue, so that I was forced to spit the beetle out, and I lost it, as well as the third one. I remember in the early part of my school life that I often had to run very quickly to be in time for the bell, and from being a fleet runner was generally successful. But when in doubt, I prayed earnestly to God to help me. And I well remember that I attributed my success to the prayers and not to my quick running, and marveled how generally I was aided. When I left school, I was, for my age, neither high nor low in it. I believe that I was considered by my masters and my father as a very ordinary boy, rather below the common standard in intellect. To my deep mortification, my father once said to me, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat-catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." But my father, who was the kindest of men I ever knew, and whose memory I love with all of my heart, must have been very angry and somewhat unjust when he used such words. In the latter part of my school life, I did become passionately fond of shooting. I do not believe that anyone could have shown more zeal for the most holy cause than I did for shooting birds. How well I remember killing my first snipe, and my excitement was so great that I had much difficulty in reloading my gun from the trembling of my hands. This taste long continued, and I became a very good shot. I spent 2 years in Edinburgh University studying medicine. During that time, I learned from my brother that we would inherit property enough to subsist on with some comfort. And this revelation was sufficient to check any strenuous efforts to learn medicine. Not to mention the intolerably dull lectures and the terrifying operations before the blessed days of chloroform. When my father learnt of my trepidations about going into medicine, he proposed that I should enroll at the University of Cambridge to prepare for the seminary and a life in the clergy. This was a sensible suggestion. I had been raised in the Church of England, what you know as the Anglican faith, and was certainly a firm believer in the Bible. Moreover, at that time, natural history and theology were considered to be mutually illuminating and even overlapping disciplines, as Professor Beatty will explain shortly. However, my father's and my plans for the seminary and the clergy were interrupted when, upon graduating from Cambridge, I joined the HMS Beagle as the naturalist. If the phrenologists are to be trusted, I was well fitted in one respect to be a clergyman. I was once told the shape of my head revealed that I had the bump of reverence developed enough for 10 priests. On account of phrenology, I was also almost rejected from serving on the Beagle. Captain Fitzroy doubted whether anyone with a nose shaped like mine could possibly possess sufficient energy and determination in the voyage. I think afterwards that he was well satisfied that my nose spoke falsely. The voyage of the Beagle was by far the most important event in my life and determined my whole career. Yet it depended on so small a circumstance as my uncle offering me to drive me 30 miles to Shrewsbury to convince my father to allow me to go. Not to mention the role played by the shape of my nose. I've always felt that I owe to the voyage the first real training or education of my mind, as I was led to attend closely to several branches of natural history, and thus my powers of observation were improved. The glories of the vegetation of the tropics rise before my mind at the present time more vividly than anything else. Although the sense of sublimity which the great deserts of Patagonia and the forest-clad mountains of Tierra del Fuego excited in me has left an indelible impression on my mind. A child with a new toy could not have been more delighted. As well, the sight of a naked savage in his native land is an event which can never be forgotten. I experienced many of my greatest highs and my lowest lows while on the voyage. The misery I endured from seasickness is far beyond what I ever would have guessed at. As well, Captain Fitzroy's temper was a most unfortunate one. He was very kind to me, but was a man very difficult to live with in the intimate terms which necessarily followed from our dining together by ourselves in the same cabin. We had several quarrels. For instance, early in the voyage in Brazil, he defended and praised slavery, which I abominated. In fact, in Rio de Janeiro, I was appalled by the cruel treatment of the slaves. But Fitzroy had told me that he had just visited a great slave owner who called up many of his slaves and asked them whether they were happy and whether they wished to be free. And they all answered no. I then asked him, perhaps with a sneer, whether he thought that the answer of slaves in the presence of their master was worth anything. This made him excessively angry, and I thought that I should have been compelled to leave the ship. But he eventually apologized, and we continued on together. There is not time tonight to recount all of the wonders that I witnessed on the voyage, but certainly among the most important were my experiences in the Galapagos archipelago. It was on that group of islands that I observed some of the most bizarre and wondrous creatures, from the large, clumsy black marine iguanas to the almost comical blue-footed boobies, to the lumbering giant tortoises, as well as the fascinatingly varied forms of mockingbirds and finches. At the time, I wrote in my notebook, seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small and intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. From the Galapagos, we sailed on to Tahiti, New Zealand, and Australia, and then around up the southern tip of Africa, made a brief stop back in Brazil to double-check a few faulty survey readings, and then, finally, back to England. Near the end, I was so tired of sailing and so eager to be home. I was forced to note in my journal that this zigzag manner of proceeding is very grievous. I loathe, I abhor the sea, and all the ships which sail on it. It was on October 2nd, 1836, that we finally reached the shores of England. After an around-the-world voyage of 4 years, 9 months, and 5 days. I set off immediately for home. I arrived at my father's house in the evening and found my entire family was fast asleep. The next morning, I strolled into the dining room while father and my sisters were having breakfast. An immediate pandemonium of delight broke out over the entire house. Much celebration commenced. A few of the servants got quite drunk.